I think it's definitely fair to say that last week's episode was a very challenging one. So this week I wanted to delve into something a little simpler. We're going to talk about pickling and its very close relative, lacto-fermentation, and I wanted to use this as an opportunity for you to glean some ideas that you can take and use in your own home kitchen. Our first pickling project will be a variation of pickled red onions, of which we're going to magically dice a bunch of garlic. I'm just kidding. Obviously we're going to have to dice it all by hand. And if you ever run into garlic that is sprouting like this, go ahead and remove that. It's been known to cause indigestion for some individuals. You're then going to want to take your onion and cut it in half, at which point you're going to want to cut it in roughly half moon shapes, like think onion rings but cut in half. I could have used more onion, believe it or not, but you know, hindsight's 20/20. After which we're going to end up putting all these onions into our container of choice. I'm actually using a mason jar, and we're just going to set that aside while we set up our pickling liquid. To begin making our pickling solution, we're going to turn our small saucepan onto high heat, and we're going to add a mixture of 50-50 water to vinegar, a quarter of that being apple cider and the other quarter being white distilled vinegar. We're then going to add our 10 grams or 2 teaspoons of sugar and we're going to add our 30 grams or 2 tablespoons of salt. At this time that we're going to take an opportunity to add our pickling spices, I'm going to add some peppercorns and mustard seed, as well as a bay leaf for a little bit of aromatic flair. If that even makes sense. Actually don't want this solution to boil, so we're going to keep an eye on it. We just want the salt and sugar to dissolve, and we want those spices to have an opportunity to meld together with our pickling solution. After which point we're going to take it off the heat, let it cool down for half a second, and then only then can we apply it to our onions. This is going to do two things. It's going to partially cook the onions, and it's going to allow the pickle to take effect. Don't forget those spices either. They're really important. Once it's cool enough to handle, you're going to put it in the fridge and let it hang out overnight. Now, canning is a slightly different animal in the sense that you have to boil your containers for 10 minutes in hot water before use. You'd also like to remove the stems of your cucumbers because they contain an enzyme that will soften them over time. Since these pickles will be shelf stable for up to 6 months, it would be best to remove the stem before canning. And of course, you're going to need an obscene amount of garlic. Now, me personally, I like to stack my spices from the bottom. It's just a personal pet peeve I have where my spices are floating on the top, getting in the way of my pickles. So you don't have to do this, but I like to do it that way. We're going to add our garlic, our black peppercorns, our mustard seed, our bay leaf, and our allspice berries. Now you probably want to use prettier dill fronds than I have here because they're kind of ugly, and I honestly could have taken more off the top of these cucumbers, but you know what, I'd rather them be packed super duper tight than have a bunch of space for them to float around in limbo. The brining solution is essentially the same, except I just use 100% white vinegar and white sugar instead of brown sugar. Now we're going to put these in a bath of 150 degrees Fahrenheit for 2.5 hours, and there's a reason for that. Because when you boil something, it actually turns the pickles into mush, and I'm not a fan of that, personally. When you do it over a low flame for a very long time, you can actually maintain that crisp, crunchy pickle that most people enjoy. See that? That's what you want. Now we're going to step out of pickling and step into lacto-fermentation, and yes, that is a Carolina Reaper. So we're going to chop up 2 pounds of those sweet baby peppers, 4 habaneros, and 2 of those little devil chilies. Now I'm cutting the peppers into little medallions because I want the fermentation to take effect very quickly. More surface area means more reaction. Hey look, that's a spoon and that's ginger. You ever peeled ginger with a spoon? You should. It's super easy. We're also going to want to chop that ginger into little medallions so that we can stick into our little fermentation. And of course, as always, more garlic. Now you'll notice that I'm using a glass vessel. That's because fermenting in plastic is not ideal. Once the lactic acid starts to take effect, it'll start wearing away at the plastic, which will begin to leach chemicals into your fermentation. It's no good for anybody. So I ended up using a mixture of peppercorns, allspice berries, some whole clove, garlic of course, cloves and ginger, as well as sugar to speed up the fermentation. Oh yeah, make sure to clean up whatever brine you spill. It's basically pepper spray. This next recipe I literally made off the top of my head. There's this place in town that sells these Korean kimchi cucumbers. They're delicious. So in order to get that kind of kimchi vibe, I just added the addition of Korean red pepper flakes. They're not that hard to find. You can find them on Amazon or Asian markets if you're lucky enough to have an Asian market. You'll notice in the last lacto-fermented recipe that I didn't give you a recipe for a brine solution. That's because there's really not one. The way I do it is this. This is the best method that I've found. You take the weight of your veggies plus the weight of your water and you multiply that by 0.025. In other words, you're making a 2.5 salinity brine. And this is perfect for our cucumbers because these cucumbers have a tendency to mold up, but you also don't want them super duper salty.
That's good.
Now, in traditional kimchi, you would actually use glutinous rice flour as a sugary lactic acid boost to get the fermentation kicked off. But to keep this fermentation a little bit more accessible, I just ended up using a little bit of brown sugar to get that whole party started. Add a ton of Korean red pepper flakes so that it looks like a Bloody Mary, and now you have the perfect amount of brine to put back into your fermentation container. It really is that easy. Something like this. Boom. And now keep in mind that this fermentation only took effect after 3 days, and that's actually when I ended up calling it. I really enjoyed pickling. This was a really fun episode to shoot, and it was really fun to eat them. Even those evil kimchi pickles.